My name is Ava Morgan, and 10 minutes before the plane lost its captain, I was nothing more than a passenger in seat 16C, sipping a plastic cup of ginger ale and ignoring my brother's smug grin. 10 minutes before everything broke, the cockpit went silent. The intercom crackled with static and the captain's voice boomed down the cabin aisle like a hammer on steel. "Is there a pilot on board?" You could have heard a pin drop. Babies whimpered. A woman clasped her rosary beads so tight her knuckles turned white. The flight attendants froze mid-step, trays trembling in their hands. Somewhere a phone clattered to the floor. And then, like the universe had been waiting for the cruelest punchline, my brother Logan laughed. "Yeah," he said loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "She's a pilot, sure, of video games." Eyes turned. Faces tightened. People whispered. And I wanted nothing more than to melt into my seat cushion. I didn't say a word. I just clenched the seat arm and looked out the window. Because Logan wasn't entirely wrong, at least not in the way he wanted people to think. He knew the truth, or part of it. Years ago, I had worn a uniform strapped into jets and carried the weight of lives on my shoulders. But he also knew I'd left it all behind, grounded by bureaucracy and betrayal. To him, I wasn't a real pilot anymore. I was just his younger sister with an Air Force past that he liked to turn into a punchline. But the problem was when the captain called out, I knew instantly I couldn't stay a passenger this time. Not with 280 people strapped inside a metal tube, streaking across the Atlantic at 35,000 feet, engines humming with a rhythm that was just one shudder away from silence. The irony. The flight had started so normal it was boring. Logan had dragged me along on this trip to Lisbon, his idea of a bonding getaway. He booked business class seats because he liked to show off, and I didn't fight him on it. I figured if I had to put up with his arrogance, at least I'd get wider legroom. The funeral was still fresh in my mind. Our mother's. She'd passed 2 weeks ago, and grief hadn't even had time to settle before Logan started talking about estate matters, financial accounts, property rights. It was his language, money contract signatures. Mine had always been engines, altitude coordinates, oil and fire instead of ink and paper. Sitting next to him on that flight felt like being trapped between two versions of myself, the soldier I once was, and the sister I could never quite stop resenting. By hour 3, I had tuned him out entirely, earbuds and listening to old playlists from my service days. Logan tapped me on the shoulder, smirking. "You still listening to that Top Gun soundtrack? Let me guess, makes you feel like a real pilot again." I ignored him. That was my tactic with Logan. Let him talk himself into silence. But then came the turbulence. Small at first, just a ripple across the cabin, a shake of water glasses, a nervous laugh from a passenger 2 rows up. Normal. Routine. Except I knew the way you know when a storm cloud isn't just passing, it was more than turbulence. I caught the shift in engine pitch. A stutter. A hesitation. Like a heartbeat skipping a note. I closed my eyes, listening with my whole body. And then came the sound no passenger wants to hear, at cruising altitude silence. The cockpit had gone dead. No calm announcement, no reassurance, just dead air. Then the captain's voice erupted, raw, panicked, breaking protocol completely. "Is there a pilot on board?" That's when Logan laughed. That's when every eye in the cabin turned to me. That's when my heart started pounding, not in fear, but in recognition. Because I had been here before. Different sky, different stakes, but the same silence, the kind that follows when the chain of command collapses and someone has to step up. I'd sworn off this life when I left the Air Force, told myself I'd never again sit behind a yoke with lives depending on me. But life has a twisted sense of humor. At 35,000 feet, it had just handed me the controls again. I didn't move right away. The whispers started, passengers looking me up and down as if trying to decide whether to place their faith in me or dismiss me like Logan had. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down heavy as a G-force turn in combat. And then I heard it, soft, Almost swallowed by the chaos, a little girl's voice from 2 rows ahead. "Mommy, are we gonna fall?" That was it. The moment the silence inside me broke. I unbuckled my belt, stood up, and walked toward the cockpit. My knees didn't shake. My palms didn't sweat. Years of training buried deep inside me rose to the surface like instinct. Logan called after me, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Ava, sit down. You don't know what you're doing." I didn't even glance back, because he was wrong. Dead wrong. I knew exactly what I was about to do. And the Air Force never forgets its own. The aisle stretched ahead of me like a gauntlet. Passengers leaned out of their seats, eyes wide, whispers rippling in my wake. Some looked hopeful, others skeptical, a few openly doubtful. I caught fragments as I passed. Is she really a pilot? She looks too young. Better her than no one. My shoulders squared with each step, though. Inside I was cataloging every possible scenario at lightning speed. What could have silenced the cockpit? Electrical short, medical emergency, engine issue. None of them were good, but some were survivable. 2 flight attendants met me halfway up the aisle, their faces pale and trembling. One, a tall brunette with a name tag that read, "Erin," blocked my path. "Ma'am, please return to your seat." The captain didn't. I cut her off gently but firmly. I heard the call. "I have flight experience." Her eyes flicked to my hands, then to my face, searching for any sign that I wasn't bluffing. "Commercial?" she asked, voice low, desperate. "Military," I said. "U.S. Air Force. Multi-engine combat clearance, over 1,000 hours logged." Her breath hitched. Relief or fear that trusting me could be worse than no one at all. The other attendant, shorter, with cropped blonde hair and steady eyes, stepped closer. "If that's true, we need you. Now." Erin hesitated but nodded, moving aside. My boots hit the carpet faster now. My pulse was steady, but adrenaline prickled my skin like static. Behind me, Logan's voice rose above the murmurs. "Don't listen to her. She hasn't flown in years. She plays video games and brags about the past. That's it." Laughter followed, nervous and brittle, the kind people use when they want to believe the worst because it's easier than hope. My jaw tightened, but I didn't turn back. Let him dig his own grave with words. I had work to do. At the cockpit door, the attendants exchanged a look. One swiped a keycard and the lock clicked. The smell hit me first, burnt plastic, acrid, sharp, the ghost of overheating wires. Not catastrophic yet, but not good either. Inside, chaos. Warning chimes pulsed from the console, red lights flashing across panels. The captain, mid-50s with salt and pepper hair, sat slumped against his harness, face, pale sweat soaking his collar. The first officer was upright but shaking, one hand gripping the yoke, the other fumbling through a checklist that might as well have been written in a foreign language. He looked up when I entered, eyes wild. "Who the hell are you?" "Captain Ava Morgan, U.S. Air Force, retired," I said quickly. "What's the situation?" He hesitated only a second before answering, desperation overriding protocol. "Captain's down. Possible cardiac event. Right engine surging, autopilot's failing to compensate. I can't keep her level alone." I slid into the auxiliary seat, buckled in, and scanned the instruments. Altitude steady at $35,000, but the right engine indicators were dancing, RPM spikes, fluctuating fuel pressure. The electrical bus wasn't distributing power evenly, which explained the flickers I'd noticed in the cabin. The captain groaned, clutching his chest. The attendant appeared behind me with an oxygen mask and AED kit. Good. They'd handle him. My job was the plane. I glanced at the first officer. "You holding steady?" "Barely," he admitted, knuckles white on the yoke. "It keeps pulling right." "Because the surge is asymmetric," I muttered, flipping a series of toggles, rerouting power to backup systems. The plane shuddered but steadied slightly. Behind me, voices filtered through the half-open cockpit door, passengers panicking, Logan's derision cutting through like a knife. "See? She's just pretending to know what she's doing." The first officer's eyes darted toward the door. Is he right? I met his gaze dead on. No, keep your focus. We don't have time for doubt. Something in my tone must have convinced him. He nodded, swallowing hard. The intercom crackled again. A flight attendant's voice, shaky but firm, announced to the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a qualified pilot assisting in the cockpit. Please remain calm. The word qualified bought me maybe 5 minutes of collective trust. After that, results would have to speak louder. The cabin pressure gauge wavered. I adjusted environmental controls, trying to balance oxygen flow. The smell of burnt insulation was growing sharper. Electrical fire, I asked. Already ran diagnostics, the first officer said. No active flame, but circuit 2's cooked. We're running half-blind. I cursed under my breath. Half-blind at 35,000 feet in a 777 was a nightmare. Still, I'd flown blind before. Different sky, different stakes, same survival math. I leaned into the controls. The yoke resisted sluggish heavy like steering through wet cement. My muscles remembered the weight, the subtle tremors that told you when an aircraft wanted to fight back. I coaxed it level, inch by inch, until the nose stopped dipping. The first officer exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for an hour. How are you doing that? Experience, I said simply. Behind me, I heard Logan's voice again, muffled through the cabin door but insistent. You're letting a gamer girl fly a commercial jet. We're all dead. Something inside me twisted, not anger, not fear, just clarity. Logan's whole life had been about controlling money, controlling narratives, controlling me. But in this cockpit, control was mine, not his. And for the first time since boarding the plane, I almost smiled. I keyed the comms. Control, this is Skybridge 502. We have a medical emergency, one engine unstable, backup systems compromised. I am assuming co-command. Static hissed, then a voice. Skybridge 502, confirm identity of alternate pilot. I straightened, voice steady as stone. Captain Ava Morgan, U.S. Air Force, retired. Flight ID 2279, former designation Eagle Squadron. There was a pause. Then the voice returned, sharper now. Copy that, Captain Morgan. Stand by for vectoring. The first officer looked at me with something close to awe. The attendants behind me whispered prayers. And for the first time since the crisis began, the cockpit wasn't pure chaos. It was mine. But the real test hadn't started yet. Because the right engine coughed again, belched smoke, and the entire plane shuddered like a living thing about to convulse. The right engine coughed again, one ragged hack that vibrated through the bones of the aircraft, and a thin gray smear ghosted past the window. The entire fuselage shivered, a metallic shudder that traveled seat track to seat track, overhead, bin to overhead bin, like panic given shape. Engine 2's unstable, the first officer said, voice clipped. Surges every 30 seconds, then drops. Treat it like it'll die on us. I kept my tone even. We fly as if we're already single engine. He nodded, swallowing. Sweat stood out along his temple. I scanned the panel, ECAS messages stacking, electrical bus shedding, non-essentials, the autopilot hunting and overshooting. The smell of scorched insulation breathed in shallow waves. Skybridge 502, the radio crackled. This is Santa Maria Oceanic. Confirm nature of emergency. I pressed transmit. Santa Maria Skybridge 502 declaring Mayday. Captain incapacitated, possible cardiac. Right engine surging, electrical irregularities. Alternate pilot assuming co-command. Request nearest suitable diversion with runway length to accept heavy twin. A beat of static. I imagined the invisible geometry of airspace rearranging around us, other aircraft, nudged aside arcs, replotted a corridor cut through the sky for the one in trouble. Copy Mayday Skybridge 502. Nearest is Lajes Tercera Island. Runway 10,000 feet. Weather light crosswind, scattered cloud, 3-mile vis in patchy mist. Do you accept Lajes? I looked to the first officer. He met my eyes and gave a small emphatic nod. We accept Lajes, I replied. Request vectors and descent profile. Stand by for vectors, and, Captain Morgan, we have your service record. Welcome back. Something unknotted beneath my sternum. Not pride permission. The Air Force never forgets its own, but tonight, the skies remembered too. Behind us, the cockpit door clicked, then jolted, someone yanking on it from the cabin. Ava Logan's voice bled through the seam, hot and incredulous. Open this door, you're going to get people killed. Aaron's voice rode over his taught and practiced. Sir, you need to step back. I lowered my mic and spoke without looking away from the panel. Lock the door. The first officer flipped the deadbolt. The sound was small, decisive, like a period at the end of a sentence. I took a breath. Okay. We're going to stabilize attitude and start down in a controlled descent. You have radios and ATC calls. I'll fly. He blinked. You want me on radios? You've got the airline call signs and company op procedures. I've got stick. My hands settled on the yoke. The jet felt wounded, heavy, reluctant, a strong horse that hadn't decided whether to trust the rider. We do this together. He nodded, relief, deference, maybe a flicker of hope. Copy. I eased left rudder, trimmed out the right pull, gentled the nose. The yoke pushed back like a stubborn shoulder. My biceps burned with the old sweet ache of work that mattered. The jet steadied. Somewhere deep in the cabin, a child stopped crying. Passengers are on edge, Aaron said, breathless, appearing in my periphery with the AED lead stuck to the captain's chest. He's breathing shallow. We have the oxygen on him. Paramedics will meet us on the ground. Good, I said. We're diverting to Lajes. Tell the cabin we are in control. Her face softened just a fraction. Yes, ma'am. Through the door, seam came Logan again, farther back now, but louder, aiming for an audience. She's not a real pilot. She quit. She plays Sims and pretends. I let the words pass over me like wind over a wing. Once they would have sliced. Tonight, they were only weather. Vectors received, the first officer said, refocusing. Turn right, heading 180. Descend and maintain flight level 280. I rolled us right, nose holding steady as we slipped onto the new heading. The Atlantic unrolled below, slate blue and indifferent. The altimeter tape crept down. With the autopilot disengaged, every adjustment was hand-stitched, tiny, deliberate stitches, pulling us toward a runway carved into volcanic rock. For a moment, the cockpit narrowed the way it always does. When the mission clarifies, instruments horizon, the steady thrum of the surviving engine, like a metronome under the skin. The rhythms stacked in my head, scan, sense, correct. Breathe, check, decide. The old training rose through me, not as memory, but as reflex. Instructors' voices ghosted through fly the airplane. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Muscle, first, mind, always. The plane jolted hard, a downdraft shouldering us. Overhead bins rattled. Erin grabbed a bulkhead to keep her footing. Sorry, I murmured to no one and everyone correcting. The yoke fought. I fought back gently. We leveled. You good? The first officer asked. I'm here, I said. I toggled the PA, tasted metal on my tongue, and pitched my voice low and even. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the flight deck. We have experienced an issue with one engine and are diverting as a precaution. You are safe. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions. We'll keep you updated. A hush rolled outward through the cabin like a sedative. When I clicked off, the first officer gave me a look, part gratitude, part disbelief. You sure you're not airline? I almost smiled. Wrong uniform, same sky. He huffed out a breath that could have been a laugh if it weren't pinned to terror. The ECAS flashed again. HYD press caution flickered and held. We've got a minor hydraulic pressure drop, I said. How minor, he asked. Enough to make the controls lazy, not enough to lose them. I feathered my grip, felt the lag, adjusted trim. We'll keep input small. No heroics. Copy. Static hissed. Skybridge 502 Santa Maria. You are cleared direct Lajes. Advise souls on board and fuel. The first officer answered 280 souls. Fuel. He did quick math, brow furrowed. Plenty to divert, too heavy to land ideal but within emergency limits. Roger 502. Emergency crews on standby. Aaron leaned in again, voice lower now, reverent around the edges. Do you need anything else from us? Secure the cabin tight, I said. No loose items, carts locked, passengers briefed on brace just in case, but don't call it yet. She nodded and faded back, her composure now a mirror of mine. Logan's voice had gone blessedly quiet. I pictured him forced into his seat by Aaron's calm authority, drowning in the silence he could no longer fill with opinions. I felt a flicker of pity, small and clean. He wasn't cruel because he was strong. He was cruel because he was afraid. Control was his raft, and tonight the ocean had come up to meet him. You okay? The first officer asked softly, eyes on the horizon. I considered. Truth might be useful here. My brother's in the cabin. He's loud when he's scared. Mine too, he said. He sells insurance, thinks pilots are glorified bus drivers. Maybe we are, I said, nudging the nose 2 hairs down, letting the altimeter unwind at a neat, disciplined rate. Except the bus is 6 miles up and the road keeps moving. He smiled, a quick flash. Fair. We dropped through 330. The engine's tantrums had settled into a sullen sulk, less violent but no more trustworthy. I treated it like a passenger who might bolt, kind, watchful, ready to restrain. Checklist, he asked. Abbreviated, I said. We don't have time for textbook. Priority is, keep it flying, keep it breathing, keep it pointed at pavement. We worked short phrases, clean handoffs. He ran the radios, coaxed data from reluctant systems, juggled the airline's dispatch loop with ATC. I flew. It felt like threading a needle in a moving car, the work itself simple, the context unforgiving. Approach at Lajes is downhill slight, he said, scanning the chart. Crosswinds from the left, shorter than you'll like. Nothing tonight is what I like, I said. But it's what we've got. The cockpit door thumped once more, half-hearted, and then stilled. Past the barrier, the cabin took on a tone I recognized from old missions, not calm exactly, but oriented. People had stopped inventing outcomes and started waiting for instructions. They had decided collectively to believe. That was a kind of fuel, too. Passing flight level 310, he said. The Atlantic breathed under us, pewter and empty. Clouds ahead like smoke laid flat. Somewhere inside my chest, a small thing settled on a perch and watched with me. The fear didn't vanish. It just learned to sit still. Santa Maria, 502 has Lajes information Delta, the first officer called. Request continuous descent profile, minimal vectoring. Approved, came the reply. Runway 15, wind 170 at 8. You're cleared as requested. My palms adjusted minutely the way hands do when they've already imagined the next 10 minutes. I could feel the runway long before I could see it. The angle, the flare, the precise heartbeat between wheels down and reverse. Tourniquet time, not too tight, not too loose, just enough to stop the bleeding. Okay, I said, more to myself than to him. We're going to make this simple. No showing off, no sudden moves. We will fly the airplane, we will put it on the ground, and then we will let the ground take over. He nodded. I'm with you. Outside, a seam of light split the cloud deck, thin as the edge of a coin. The world below waited, unaware of the drama it was about to witness, or the lives it was about to return to. I breathed in the burnt plastic air, tasted salt, focused my eyes on the invisible runway stitched into mist. I'm taking the controls, I said. All the way in. Your controls, he answered. My hands tightened on the yoke. The jet answered, reluctant, then resigned, then somehow willing. We began our descent to the island. The descent began in silence. Not silence outside the jet still hissed with slipstream engines moaned in wounded rhythm, alarms blinked like stubborn Christmas lights, but silence within me. The kind that used to settle in just before weapons release, or a night carrier landing in blackout conditions. Noise all around, but a pool of quiet inside, where decisions lived. Passing flight level 280, the first officer reported his voice steadier now. He'd started to lean on me maybe without realizing it, mirroring my cadence, even his breathing falling into rhythm. "Roger," I said, fingers light but insistent on the yoke. "Keep your scans wide, don't fixate." The cockpit was tight-hot with the smell of sweat and fried circuitry. Aaron slipped in once, eyes darting to the captain still slumped with oxygen mask pressed to his face. She mouthed, "He's holding on," before vanishing back into the cabin. The door latched again, cutting us back to our crucible of steel and air. The right engine shuddered like a coughing giant. Its gauges fluttered, dropped, then caught again. The airframe shimmied. I feathered inputs, coaxing it level. "We treat her gentle," I muttered. "Like she's already half dead." The first officer nodded. "Got it." The radio buzzed alive, Skybridge 502, confirm number of able crew on flight deck. "This is Captain Ava Morgan, Air Force retired," I answered. "First officer stable, captain incapacitated but alive. We're two at the controls." A pause. Then, "Roger that 502. You are cleared direct to Lajes. Expect vectors for ILS runway 15. Emergency cruise positioned. Godspeed." "Copy." I clicked off, muscles loosening by a fraction. Behind the door, muffled chaos throbbed, babies, crying voices overlapping Logan's sharper tones, needling above the rest. Even when lives dangled on a thread, he couldn't resist controlling the narrative. "She's not rated. She's been grounded for years. This is suicide." His voice bled through, faint but vicious, amplified by fear. The first officer grimaced. "You want me to say something to shut him down?" "No." I kept my eyes on the horizon. "Let him talk. Words can't crash an airplane." Still the echo of his laughter gnawed at memory. "She only plays video games." He wasn't entirely wrong. I had played hours in front of glowing screens, a joystick clutched tight. But those simulators had been my first training ground, the stepping stone to jets that could crack Mach. And now the skills that started in pixels were writing in steel and sky. The plane jolted hard left. Warnings chirped. "Autopilot disengage. Stall protection limited." I gripped the yoke, fighting the drift. "We're hand-flying from here. No more computer crutches." The first officer's hands hovered uncertainly over his column, but he let go when he saw the steadiness in mine. "Your controls." "Confirmed," I said. And they were. The Atlantic spread endless below, but ahead there, through ragged curtains of cloud, a shadow of land began to form. Terceira Island runway carved into volcanic stone, our single thread of hope. ATC crackled again. 502, you are cleared down to 10,000. Begin descent profile now. "Copy," I answered, nose down, gently trim, compensating. The altimeter unwound like a clock spinning toward a deadline. The first officer flipped through approach charts paper, trembling slightly. "Runway, 15 length, 10,000 feet. Slight downhill slope. Crosswind from port side, 8 knots. Terrain on final volcanic ridge left side." "I've seen worse," I said, though the weight in my chest knew we were balancing on a knife edge. The cockpit door rattled. Suddenly. Thump. Thump. Desperate pounding. Logan's voice muffled through. "Let me in. Somebody stop her. She'll kill us all." Aaron's bark cut across. "Sir, sit down, or you'll be restrained." A scuffle, then quiet. The first officer raised an eyebrow. "That your brother?" "Unfortunately." He almost smiled, tension cracking for a heartbeat. "Family, huh?" "Yeah." My eyes stayed locked on the gauges. "Family." We broke through a thin layer of cloud. Below the island stretched like a dark emerald dropped in slate water, its runway gleaming faint silver under scattered mist. My pulse quickened, not fear but focus sharpening to a point. Visual acquired, I said. The first officer exhaled. Thank God. But the right engine sputtered again, belching a cough of smoke. The aircraft lurched, nose-yawing starboard. Warning tones blared. Engine 2's gone, I said calmly, shutting its fuel line and feathering systems. Single engine ops now. The first officer blanched. At this weight. At any weight. My voice cut steel. We're not debating physics, we're landing. He nodded, gulped, and returned to radios. Santa Maria, 502, now single engine continuing approach. Roger 502, came the reply. Wind steady. Emergency crews standing by. The runway loomed closer, stretching like salvation. My palms sweated under gloves, but my grip was true. Every vibration, every shiver of the yoke fed into my muscles like a second language long forgotten, but instantly remembered. I whispered under my breath, not for the first officer, not for ATC, not for Logan, but for myself. Fly the airplane. Nothing else matters. Beside me, the first officer glanced once, then back at his gauges. You've done this before, haven't you? Enough times, I said. But never with him watching. I jerked my chin toward the cabin where Logan sat somewhere behind the barrier of steel and fear. The clouds tore open, revealing the runway in full, long, narrow, with mist curling at its edges. I aligned us, crosswind nudging from port. My jaw tightened. We'll crab in straight and last second. Keep speed 10 knots above ref until flare. Copy, the first officer said, his voice almost steady now. The alarms faded into background noise. The cabin fell into hush. Even Logan for once was silent. And in that silence I remembered every night sortie, every carrier trap, every time the sky had demanded all of me. This was no different. This was exactly the same. I tightened my grip on the yoke. Your controls? The first officer repeated softly, as if reaffirming faith. My controls, I answered. And together, with the island rising to meet us, we dove toward the strip of concrete carved from rock, carrying 280 lives balanced on the knife edge of one forgotten pilot's hands. The island swelled in the windscreen, dark stone torn green, a sliver of runway pointing like a blade at the sea. Crosswind shoved at our left cheek, insistent but not vicious, the kind that tests your judgment more than your strength. I held the crab-nosed, slightly canted wings steady, the kind of posture that makes passengers think the pilot forgot which way is straight until the flare proves otherwise. Speed checks, the first officer said, voice almost normal. Ref +10. Hold it, I answered. No chasing airspeed. Let it come to us. The single engine hummed with a wounded animal's stubbornness, pushing against drag, against fear, against gravity's patient arithmetic. The dead right engine's fan windmilled a sullen disk of refusal. The yoke felt heavier than it should, hydraulics a beat late to every suggestion. My forearms began to burn slow and bright. Santa Maria Skybridge 502 established on final, the first officer called. Single engine, field in sight. 502, you're cleared to land, runway 15, ATC replied. Wind 170 at 8, emergency units standing by. Cleared to land 15, he echoed, eyes flicking to me. Gear, I said. He dropped the lever. The aircraft thumped 1-2 and a reluctant third clunk. 3 green. Good. I imagined 3 little lanterns at the edge of a dark field waiting for us to come home. Flaps, I said. 25, he replied, fingers dancing. The wing shook, remembered how to carry us at slower breath. The cockpit smelled like hot plastic and adrenaline. My tongue tasted like pennies. I rolled my shoulders once, finding a millimeter more room inside my ribcage. Outside, the runway drew its black ribbon tight centerline, bright as bone. Cabin secure, Aaron's voice came through the interphone. Passengers briefed. I pictured the rows behind the door heads, bowed hands, interlaced strangers sharing a lifeline made of silence. Somewhere in 22A, a child with big eyes held a cheap airline crayon too tight. The wax would snap the second we touched down. Somewhere near row 16, Logan sat with his jaw clamped shut for the first time in a decade. "Localizer alive," the first officer said. "Glide slope captured." "I have it visual," I told him. "We'll ride the needles, but we'll trust the window." The wind nudged. I nudged back. The approach became a conversation without pride, the air telling me its intentions, me acknowledging bargaining, never demanding. The nose stayed canted, left crab held a tiny dance step learned long ago on a runway far from any ocean. 5 miles, he said. Altitude good. Checklist short, I replied. Landing brief. Crabbing to flare. Kick straight last second. Single engine reverse only. Manual braking firm progressive. No heroics. If she floats, we eat the float. We don't stuff it. Copy, he said. He swallowed. Ava. Yeah. Whatever happens, I'm grateful you're here. I didn't look over. Same. We hit 3 miles and the runway filled the world. The island's ridge shouldered us on the left, black rocks hunched like long, sleeping beasts. Mist licked at the approach lights. The Popeye strobes winked even white, then blushed red, then even again. I eased a hair of power, felt the single engine's response like a pulse under my palm. Speed ref +8, he said. Hold. The alarms had quieted, or maybe my mind had learned to ignore their hunger. My hearing tunneled to the hum of airflow, the whisper of flaps, the creak of seat rails. The yoke trembled in a way I knew, the prelude to a light burble at the threshold. Good. Predictable. Still air would have been a lie. Wind now 160 at 9, ATC said. You're looking good. Appreciate it, the first officer replied, the grin audible. Then to me, 2 miles. I breathed once, big, slow, purposeful, and felt my pulse drop into the pocket where all decisions are clean. Time did not slow. I did. 1,000 stable, he called. Continuing, I answered. The crosswind gave one last shove. I let it. The jet and I met in the middle, me offering restraint, it offering lift. Somewhere behind us, 100 prayers tangled into a net we couldn't see, but could feel. 500, he said, on path, on speed. Autopilot off, I said, which it already was, but the words were a ritual, a ringing of a bell in an old chapel. My airplane. Your airplane, he echoed, softer now, like an oath. The runway rushed up, detail sharpening the grooves, the paint scars, the faint smears of rubber from every ghost of landing past. I began the D-crab left rudder, easing out, nose yawing to align a whisper of opposite aileron to keep the upwind wing honest. 200, he said, wind steady. Trust it, I murmured to the jet, to my hands, to the air that had carried me out and back again 100 times. 100. Set. 50. His voice thinned. 40. 30. 20. I rolled the last of the yaw out, felt the mains searching for earth. 10. I closed the throttle, held the yoke a breath longer, wait, then tick the flare. The mains kissed the runway soft, then urgent, a handclasp turning into a grip. The left wheel bit first, the right lagged a heartbeat, then settled. The tail wanted to sashay. I caught it with rudder gentle and relentless. Reverse, I said. Left engine reverse deployed, he replied, already pulling the bucket. The asymmetry tried to swing us. I fed the opposite rudder brakes, coming in like a tide, not a stomp, not a squeeze, a persuasion. The tires sang. The nose gear thumped down, then steadied. The runway lights ticked by like counting beads, 1, 2, 3, and the end of pavement waited with trees beyond a dark congregation holding its breath. 80 knots, he called. 60. Hold centerline, I said, not to him, to myself, to the machine that had decided to live. My calves burned against the pedals. The yoke felt like bone and will. 40, he said. Emergency cruise pacing left. The fire truck strobed in my peripheral vision, red and blue and white, the colors of a heartbeat. I eased off reverse, let the brakes finish the sermon. The aircraft quivered, shook, then finally miraculously rolled to a crawl. 20 knots, he said. 10. We stopped 3 runway lights short of the end. The silence that followed was not the thin, panicked quiet of the sky at 35,000 feet. It was thick, human, a dam breaking, holding back the roar of relief. I set the parking brake. My hands did not know how to let go of the yoke. They stayed a second longer, then another, then relaxed one finger at a time, like a fist unclenching after a long, righteous fight. Skybridge 502 ATC, said voice, a little choked. Welcome to Lajes. Emergency vehicles approaching. Do you require assistance in the cockpit? I glanced at the captain. His color had improved a shade. Erin hovered with the AED eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. We have a medical issue with the captain, I answered. Request immediate paramedics. Cabin is intact. Copy. They're rolling. The first officer swore softly, one syllable reverent as a prayer. Then he laughed, one startled bark of disbelief. You did that. We did that, I corrected, but I couldn't quite manage a smile. My body was trembling in a way that felt subterranean, like the island itself was shivering through me. I flipped the PA. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the flight deck. We are on the ground. Please remain seated as the crew coordinates with emergency personnel. You are safe. A beat. And then the cabin erupted, not a cheer at first, but the wet, open sound of people remembering how to breathe. Somewhere, a high, small voice squeaked, "We're alive." And then the cheer rose, ragged and gorgeous, a human thunder that rattled the panels better than any alarm ever could. I closed my eyes. For one brief, selfish second, I let the sound wash the salt from my tongue. When I opened them, the first officer had his head in his hands. He lifted it, looked at me, and, whatever he'd been about to say, died on his lips. He settled for thank you. Don't thank me yet, I said, because the checklist wasn't over, and neither was the night. We still have fire crews, medics, and a cabin full of hearts to shepherd. He nodded, sobered, and keyed the interphone to coordinate with Erin. Outside, the trucks angled in men and women in gear jogging toward us. The smell of hot brakes seeped up from the nose wheel, well, sharp and righteous. I looked once at the cockpit door. Through it came a stifled sob, a laugh, the strange music of shock turning into gratitude. Somewhere in that chorus, my brother sat very still. The words he'd thrown, gamer, washed up, not a real pilot, had evaporated on the runway like morning mist. I rested my palms on the yoke one last time, then let go. Welcome back, the sky seemed to say. I'm here, I thought. And for tonight, that was enough. The fire trucks surrounded us in a slow ballet of flashing lights. Through the cockpit windows, I could see crews fanning out, helmets, reflective jackets, hoses at the ready. They didn't look panicked. They looked professional, the way you want people to look when the world has already bent and you're counting on strangers to steady it. Engines shut down, the first officer said, flipping guarded switches. The left turbine spooled down with a weary sigh. The right had already died a mile back. The sudden stillness was louder than the roar had been. Checklist complete, I said. My voice cracked halfway through and I cleared my throat. Parking brake set. Parking brake set, he echoed. His hands were trembling now that the fight was over. I realized mine were too. Emergency medics clambered up the jet bridge stairs with an AED and a stretcher. Erin guided them in. They worked quickly, moving the unconscious captain onto the stretcher, oxygen mask still on. One of the medics met my eyes, a brief nod, no promises, just acknowledgement that he was in their hands now. The cockpit door stood open for the first time since the silence at 35,000 feet. Beyond it, the cabin buzzed with relief that hadn't found its shape yet. Some passengers cried openly, others laughed too loud. A few just sat stunned, clutching armrests with white knuckles that didn't want to let go. I unbuckled and stepped into the aisle. The sound swelled around me like surf cheers applause voices calling thanks in 3 languages. A little girl with pigtails, Sophie, maybe 8 years old, leaned over her mother's lap and held up a drawing scrawled in crayon. A stick figure plane with a smiling woman at the front. In shaky block letters, "Real Pilot." It undid me more than the runway had. My throat closed. My eyes burned. I crouched, accepted the drawing, and whispered, "You kept us brave." Sophie grinned a gap-toothed grin, and for a moment the world was perfect. Then Logan appeared. He didn't clap. He didn't cheer. He just stood at the bulkhead staring like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. His jaw worked, but no words came out. Not thank you, not sorry, not even one of his usual quips. He just stepped aside and let me pass, face pale, lips pressed tight. By the time we deplaned into the humid Atlantic night, cameras were already flashing. Airport staff had tipped off the local press. A cluster of reporters pushed forward, microphones snapping like insects. "Miss, are you really the passenger who landed the jet? Were you trained on video games or actual simulators? Are you a hero, or did you put everyone in danger?" That last question stung, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. For every hour I'd flown in uniform, there had been doubters. People who saw the braid of my hair before the wings on my chest. People who looked at the joystick in my hand and said, "Toy soldier." People who assumed a woman's seat in a cockpit was charity, not merit. Logan's laughter had been just one voice in a chorus that had followed me my whole career. The reporters wanted a quote. I gave them one, short and flat. "I did what was necessary. The crew and I worked together. Everyone is safe. That's the only story here." They didn't like that. They wanted drama, tears, confession. I gave them discipline instead. Hours, blurred statements to investigators, quick medical checks, the cloying taste of vending machine coffee. The FAA liaison who arrived from Lisbon had sharp eyes and sharper questions. "Captain Morgan," she said, reading my name off a clipboard, "you've been out of active duty for how long?" 5 years, I answered. "Current type rating?" "None for commercial." "So you understand our concern?" I did. Regulations existed for a reason, but so did emergencies. With respect, I said, if I hadn't stepped in, you wouldn't be taking my statement tonight. You'd be writing condolences. She didn't flinch. "Perhaps. But you'll need to appear in Lisbon for a formal inquiry. We'll need to review cockpit voice recordings, maintenance logs, passenger testimony." I signed the forms without protest. Bureaucracy always arrived after survival like smoke after fire. Still, as I left the sterile briefing room, doubt gnawed at me. What if the landing hadn't been textbook? What if the nose wheel had wandered? What if the brakes had run hot? The investigators would dissect every second. Hero or liability? Sometimes the line was drawn by paperwork. In the terminal, passengers clustered in tired groups waiting for hotels or rebookings. When I passed, conversations hushed, then swelled again, softer this time, warmer. Strangers reached for my hands. A man in a suit hugged me without asking. A grandmother kissed my cheek. Sophie ran up again, pressing a second drawing into my palm, this one of 2 stick figures holding hands with the caption, "Don't let go." Logan lingered by a window apart from the crowd. For once, he had no audience. I thought about walking past him, letting silence be the final revenge, but I stopped. He turned startled, then tried to smirk. It collapsed halfway. "So, you really flew it?" "I didn't really fly it," I said, weary. "I flew it. Period." He looked down, hands jammed in his pockets. "I didn't think you had it in you anymore." I let that sit. The old Ava would have fought for validation, demanded apology. The Ava who had just flown a crippled jet on one engine didn't need it. "You didn't have to think it," I said softly. "I did." He flinched like I'd struck him. Then he nodded once, sharp and small, and looked away. When I finally boarded the shuttle to the crew hotel, fatigue hit like a wave. My arms ached from wrestling hydraulics. My eyes burned from salt and smoke. My throat felt raw from steadying my voice against panic. In the window's reflection, I saw myself not a hero, not a fraud. Just a woman who had been asked by the sky one more time to prove what she already knew: the Air Force never forgets its own. I tucked Sophie's crayon drawing into my jacket pocket, not as proof, as reminder. Tomorrow the questions would sharpen, the headlines would twist, the FAA would decide if I was savior or scandal. But tonight, in the hush after chaos, I knew one thing. The passengers had walked away. And that in aviation is the only victory that matters. The morning after Lisbon's sun cut through hotel curtains with cruel brightness. My body felt like it had been hollowed out, every tendon aching from adrenaline that had nowhere left to burn. I stood at the sink, splashed cold water on my face, and studied the woman in the mirror. Hair wild circles under my eyes, hands still trembling when I held them up. The news was everywhere. Screens in the lobby, push alerts on phones, even whispers in the elevator. Passenger saves jet from fiery crash. Some called me a hero. Others predictably used words like reckless, unqualified liability. The split didn't surprise me. Survival stories always turned into debates for people who hadn't been there. An Air Force liaison arrived at noon. Major Patel, calm voice, sharp posture, the kind of presence that reminded me I was still part of something bigger. He handed me a folder. Inside, a preliminary joint report. Captain Ava Morgan acted within reasonable emergency authority. No violation of aviation law identified at this stage. Relief came slow, not like a flood, but like a drip filling a basin. Not absolution, not yet, but not condemnation either. By evening, the FAA inquiry convened in a conference room that smelled like stale carpet and paper coffee cups. Rows of officials, some in suits, some in uniform, all staring at me as if I were both specimen and suspect. "Why did you enter the cockpit without clearance from Airline Command?" one asked. "Because Airline Command wasn't at 35,000 feet, I said evenly. "We were." A few raised eyebrows, a few scribbled notes. I kept my tone calm, steady, refusing to give them the drama they were fishing for. They asked about my military record, about the simulator hours that never translated into civilian-type ratings, about the concussion years ago that Logan would have weaponized if he could. But I didn't flinch. I answered clean, precise, unshaken. When it ended, the chairwoman closed her binder. "Captain Morgan, this panel acknowledges that your actions preserved life. Official conclusion will follow, but let the record reflect you brought them home." That was the only sentence I cared to remember. 2 days later, passengers were released to continue their journeys. Some found me in the terminal, pressed notes into my hand, whispered thank yous, cried quietly against my shoulder. Sophie gave me one last drawing, a plane with all its engines intact sailing above the clouds. Underneath, she'd scrawled, "Thank you for the sky." I carried it in my jacket pocket all the way back to Virginia. Logan called once. I didn't pick up. Later, he sent a message. "Didn't know you still had it." Guess I was wrong. I didn't reply. Revenge didn't need my voice. It had already spoken the moment 300 strangers walked away from twisted metal that should have been their grave. His laughter on that plane would echo forever, but not as an insult, only as proof of how small he'd made himself when the world needed more. Weeks passed. The headlines dulled. The internet moved on to its next obsession. But something in me had shifted. For years, I'd told myself my Air Force chapter was closed, that I'd left the cockpit behind. That day in the sky proved otherwise. The Air Force doesn't forget its own, and neither does the sky. So I returned. Not to combat, not to war zones, but to something quieter, deeper. I accepted a post as an instructor at a flight program for women stepping into aviation. Cadets with nervous hands and bright eyes, some of them the first in their families to ever dream of flying. On my desk, I kept Sophie's drawing pinned to the corkboard. Every time a cadet flared too hard on landing or fought the yoke instead of flowing with it, I'd point to that sketch. See this? That's why we train, because sometimes the world will ask more of you than you think you have, and when it does, you'll find it. One evening long after the cadets had left, I walked the empty tarmac. The desert sky glowed purple stars already punching holes in the horizon. I closed my eyes, hearing again the silence in the cockpit, the intercom's static, the captain's shout. Is there a pilot on board? I remembered Logan's laugh. She only plays video games. And I remembered the hush that followed my voice when I answered that call. Not bravado, not performance, just choice, just duty. That silence had been my revenge. Not the applause, not the headlines, not even the inquiries. The silence, the stunned moment when every doubter realized I was the only one left to believe in. If you've listened this far, maybe you've faced your own silence. A moment when everyone doubted you, when family sneered, when the world thought you weren't enough. My story isn't about proving them wrong. It's about proving yourself right. So, if you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or laughed at for dreaming too big, I want you to remember this. Sometimes the loudest answer isn't anger, it's action. And if this story stayed with you, share it. Leave a comment. Subscribe for more. Let's keep telling the stories that remind us why quiet revenge is the sweetest kind, because it doesn't tear someone down. It lifts you higher. Higher than doubt, higher than fear, higher than 35,000 feet.